My stepmother claimed she wanted to be a mother to me, but she always put her kids first. And then, when my dad told me he was getting remarried, I'll admit, I was cautiously excited. It had been 5 years since my mom passed away, and for most of that time, it was just me, Dad, and Luke. We had our rhythm, our weird little trio that worked. But Dad looked happier than I'd seen him in years, and Grace, the woman he was marrying, seemed nice enough at first. She was warm and welcoming, the kind of person who always had a smile ready and a plate of cookies in the oven. When Dad introduced us to her kids, Oliver and Sophia, I thought it was going to be the start of something great. Oliver was only 2 years younger than me, and Sophia was a bubbly 12-year-old who reminded me a bit of Luke. I pictured us all becoming this big, happy family. Grace even took me aside one day before the wedding and said, "Nathan, I want you to think of me as a second mom. I'll never replace your mom, but I promise to love you like my own." I wanted to believe her. I really did. The first few weeks were fine. Grace moved into our house with Oliver and Sophia, and it felt like a fresh start. She cooked elaborate dinners, hung cheerful pictures in the living room, and even helped Luke with his homework when Dad was busy. It felt good to have more people around the table, and I started thinking maybe this new family could actually work. But it didn't take long for things to shift. It started small. One night, we were all watching a movie, and I called dibs on the recliner, my usual spot. Grace told me to let Oliver have it because he'd had a rough day. Then there was the time she signed Sophia up for ballet lessons, but didn't mention Luke's art class until I brought it up. "Oh, I must have forgotten," she said with an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I told myself I was overthinking it. Grace was just trying to juggle a lot. Blending families is hard, right? That's what Dad kept saying. "Give her time, Nate," he told me one night when I mentioned it. "She's doing her best." But her best always seemed to focus on Oliver and Sophia. The real wake-up call came on my 17th birthday. Dad had promised to take me and a couple of friends to this paintball place I'd been dying to try. I woke up that morning buzzing with excitement, but when I came downstairs, Grace was already in a frenzy. "Nathan, could we do a rain check on paintball? Oliver has a big soccer game today, and I think it's important for the whole family to be there to support him." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "It's my birthday," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She frowned like I just said something deeply unreasonable. "I know, sweetheart, and we'll celebrate tonight. But soccer is a team sport. Oliver's counting on us to cheer him on." Dad came into the kitchen then, coffee mug in hand, and I looked at him, hoping he'd back me up. He just gave me that sheepish look he always wore when Grace started laying down the law. "We can reschedule paintball, Nate. It's not a big deal." It was a big deal. But I went to the stupid game anyway, sitting in the bleachers while Oliver strutted around the field like he owned it. No one even mentioned my birthday until we got home that night, and by then, the excitement had soured into something bitter. Grace lit a store-bought cake and sang "Happy Birthday" like she was ticking off a chore on her to-do list. That was the first time I realized I wasn't part of Grace's family. I was a guest in my own house. It only got worse from there. Grace had a knack for making me feel invisible in ways that were hard to call out without sounding petty. Like when she started doing family dinners every Sunday but always managed to schedule them around Oliver's soccer practices or Sophia's recitals. Luke and I, we were just the supporting cast. One time, I asked her if I could invite Dylan, my best friend, to dinner. "Of course," she said with that overly bright smile. But when the day came, she conveniently forgot to set a place for him. "Oh, I didn't realize you were serious," she said as Dylan awkwardly stood there. "There's not really enough food, but you can hang out after dinner." Dylan didn't stay long that night. After he left, he said, "Dude, I don't know how you put up with her." I didn't know either. Things came to a head about a month later when Luke came to me, upset. Grace had promised to take him to the zoo, but she canceled last minute because Sophia had a birthday party to attend. She said I could go next weekend, Luke muttered, trying to act like it didn't bother him, but I could tell it did. He was 8, too young to understand the complicated web of favoritism and neglect Grace was weaving around us, but old enough to feel it. That night, I went to Dad and tried to lay it out for him. "I feel like Grace doesn't actually see me or Luke as part of this family," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's always about Oliver and Sophia. Dad sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. She's under a lot of pressure, Nate. She's trying to make everyone happy. Everyone except us. I shot back. He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he just said, give it time. But time wasn't fixing anything. It was only making the cracks deeper. After my birthday fiasco, I decided to keep my head down and ride things out. I figured if I stayed out of Grace's way, maybe things would improve. I focused on school, hung out with Dylan when I could, and spent time with Luke whenever Grace wasn't pulling him into her version of family time. But the favoritism didn't just continue. It grew worse. It felt like Grace was going out of her way to make sure Oliver and Sophia got everything they wanted, while Luke and I were just afterthoughts. The breaking point came on a Friday evening, about a month after my birthday. I was sitting in the living room with Luke, trying to help him build a Lego set he'd been excited about for weeks. Grace and Oliver walked in, and I immediately noticed Grace had that look, the one she wore when she was about to ask me to do something that wasn't really a request. Nathan, she said in her syrupy sweet voice, can you help Oliver with his science project? It's due Monday, and he's been struggling. I glanced at Oliver, who didn't look the least bit concerned about his project. I'm helping Luke right now, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Maybe after we're done. Grace's smile faltered for a split second before she quickly recovered. Luke's project isn't due until next week, right? I'm sure he can wait a little while. Luke frowned, his tiny hands clutching the Lego pieces. But we're almost done. It's okay, buddy, I said, trying to reassure him. We'll finish later. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I stood up and followed Oliver to the dining table. Grace gave me a bright smile, as if I'd just passed some kind of loyalty test. Oliver's project turned out to be a disaster. He hadn't done any research or prep, and it was clear he expected me to do most of the work. I tried to guide him, but every suggestion I made was met with a shrug or an eye roll. After about an hour, I was ready to give up. Oliver, you've got to put in some effort here, I said, frustrated. I can't do this for you. He leaned back in his chair and smirked. Grace said you'd help me. Isn't that your job? My blood boiled. My job? Before I could respond, Grace walked into the room, carrying a plate of cookies like we were in some 1950s sitcom. How's it going, boys? She asked, setting the cookies down in front of Oliver. I looked at her, struggling to keep my cool. It's not going great. Oliver hasn't done any of the work. Grace tilted her head, her smile never wavering. Oh, I'm sure he's just overwhelmed. Why don't you keep helping him? You're so good at this stuff, Nathan. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command disguised as a compliment. I clenched my jaw and went back to the project, silently fuming. That night, I vented to Dylan over text. She treats me like I'm her personal assistant, I wrote. It's like Oliver and Sophia are royalty, and Luke and I are just the staff. Dylan replied almost instantly. Asterisk, that's not normal, man. Have you talked to your dad about it? Asterisk. Asterisk, he won't listen. He always sides with her, asterisk. You can't let this keep going, Dylan wrote back. She's walking all over you. I stared at his message, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. I knew he was right, but what could I do? Grace had this way of making herself look like the perfect stepmom whenever Dad was around. He never saw the way she treated me when it was just us. The real betrayal came the following week. It started with something small, as these things often do. Luke had been saving up for weeks to buy a new video game, and he was so excited to finally get it. Grace offered to drive him to the store, and I thought, maybe she's trying to make an effort, but when they came back, Luke didn't have his game. They didn't have it, he said quietly, staring at the floor. That didn't make sense. I knew the store had it in stock because I'd checked online that morning. I pulled Luke aside later and asked him what really happened. At first, he hesitated, but eventually, he admitted the truth. Grace said we didn't have time, he muttered. She had to pick up Sophia from her friend's house. I was livid. Luke had been looking forward to this for weeks, and Grace couldn't even spare 10 minutes to let him buy his game. It was yet another reminder that we didn't matter to her. The final straw came a few days later. Grace organized a big family dinner to celebrate Oliver's soccer win. She went all out, decorations, a catered meal, even a cake with "Way to go, Oliver" written on it. It was over the top, but I kept my mouth shut, not wanting to ruin the evening for Dad. During dinner, Grace started going on about how proud she was of Oliver and how he was such a shining example for the family. I couldn't take it anymore. You know, Luke won his spelling bee last week, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Should we get him a cake too? The table went silent. Grace gave me a tight smile, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Nathan, this isn't about Luke. Tonight is Oliver's night. And when's it ever going to be Luke's night? I shot back. Or mine, for that matter. Dad cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Nathan, don't make a scene. I'm not making a scene, I said, my voice rising. I'm just tired of being treated like I don't exist. Grace gasped, clutching her chest like I just insulted her entire lineage. I can't believe you'd say that. I've done nothing but try to make you feel included. I laughed bitterly. Yeah, sure. As long as included means doing all the work and getting none of the credit. Dad stood up, his face red. That's enough, Nathan. Apologize to Grace. Why should I? I snapped. She's the one who should be apologizing. To me, to Luke, to you. Grace's eyes filled with fake tears, and she turned to Dad. James, I don't know what I've done to make him hate me so much. I've tried so hard to be a good stepmother. Dad put a hand on her shoulder, glaring at me. Go to your room, Nathan. Now. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Fine. Enjoy your perfect family. I stormed upstairs, slamming the door behind me. As I sat on my bed, seething, I realized something important. Grace wasn't just playing favorites. She was actively working to push me and Luke out. And the worst part? Dad couldn't, or wouldn't, see it. That night, I decided I wasn't going to sit back and let her win. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to find a way to expose her for who she really was. After the disaster of Oliver's celebration dinner, things in the house grew even more strained. Dad barely spoke to me unless it was to lecture me about respecting Grace, and Grace avoided me entirely, except to toss out subtle digs about my attitude. Luke, sweet kid that he was, kept trying to cheer me up, but I could tell he was just as confused and hurt as I was. It felt like the walls of the house were closing in, and there was no escape. Grace seemed to double down on her favoritism after that night. She started organizing family activities that conveniently excluded me. One Saturday, I came downstairs to find everyone piling into the car with picnic baskets and folding chairs. When I asked what was going on, Grace gave me an apologetic smile. Oh, it's just a little outing to watch Oliver's soccer practice. I didn't think you'd be interested. Practice? I said, incredulous. You're taking the whole family to watch practice? Oliver asked, she said with a shrug, as if that explained everything. Feel free to join if you want, but it's mostly for the kids. I wanted to scream. I'm still a kid too, I wanted to say, but what was the point? They left without me, and I spent the rest of the day holed up in my room, trying to keep my anger from boiling over. The breaking point came a few weeks later when Grace pulled a stunt that went beyond simple favoritism. It was outright manipulation. Luke had been begging Dad to let him sign up for baseball, and Dad finally agreed. Grace said she'd handle the registration, but weeks went by, and nothing happened. When I asked Luke about it, he shrugged, clearly upset. Grace said we missed the deadline, he mumbled. I guess I'll do it next year. That didn't sit right with me. Grace was usually on top of things when it came to Oliver and Sophia's activities. Why would she suddenly drop the ball on Luke's? Suspicious, I decided to do some digging. That night, when everyone was asleep, I crept downstairs and rummaged through the stack of mail on the kitchen counter. Sure enough, I found a registration form for the local baseball league, complete with a handwritten note from the league coordinator. Deadline extended to March 15th. Hope to see Luke there. I stared at the note, my heart pounding. It was mid-February. There was still plenty of time to sign Luke up. Grace hadn't missed the deadline, she'd lied. The next morning, I confronted her in the kitchen while Dad was at work. Why didn't you register Luke for baseball? I asked, holding up the note. Grace looked up from her coffee, her face carefully neutral. I told him we missed the deadline. That's a lie, I said, my voice sharp. The deadline was extended. You didn't even try. Her expression hardened. Watch your tone, Nathan. I don't appreciate being accused of lying. Then tell me the truth. I shot back. You just didn't want to bother with it, did you? Because Luke isn't your priority. He never has been. Grace set her mug down with a loud clink. I don't have to explain myself to you. You're a child. No, I'm not, I said, my voice rising. I'm the only one in this house who sees what you're doing. You don't care about Luke or me. You only care about Oliver and Sophia. You're not a mother. You're a fraud. Her face flushed with anger, but she didn't say a word. Instead, she stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my fists clenched at my sides. That evening, she spun the whole thing into another one of her victim stories. James, she said over dinner, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing, I don't know what to do with Nathan. He's been so hostile lately, accusing me of all sorts of things. I'm trying so hard to make this family work, but he's making it impossible. Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. Nathan, we've talked about this. You need to give Grace a chance. She's doing her best. No, she's not, I snapped. She lied about Luke's baseball registration. She doesn't care about us, Dad. She only cares about Oliver and Sophia. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her chest like I just slapped her. That's not true. I love all of you equally. Then why didn't you sign Luke up for baseball? I demanded, my voice trembling with rage. Why is it always about Oliver and Sophia? Dad held up his hand. Enough, Nathan. I'm sick of this attitude. Apologize to Grace. I'm not apologizing, I said through gritted teeth. She's the one who should apologize. To me, to Luke, to you. Go to your room, Dad said, his tone final. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Fine, I muttered. But don't come crying to me when you realize she's been playing you this whole time. I stormed upstairs, slamming the door behind me. For a long time, I just sat on my bed, staring at the wall, my mind racing. I couldn't keep living like this, but I didn't know how to fix it. Every time I tried to speak up, Grace twisted the narrative, and Dad fell for it every single time. The next day, I decided to confide in Dylan. We met up at our usual spot, a bench in the park near his house, and I told him everything. The favoritism, the lies, the way Grace had systematically pushed me and Luke to the margins of our own family. That's messed up, Dylan said, shaking his head. Have you thought about talking to someone else? Like a teacher or a counselor? I don't want to air my family's dirty laundry, I admitted. But I'm running out of options. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What about your dad? I mean, really talking to him, not in the middle of an argument. Maybe if you showed him proof. I thought about the registration form I'd found. Maybe Dylan was right. Maybe if I laid everything out for Dad, he'd finally see Grace for who she really was. It was a long shot, but it was better than doing nothing. That night, I waited until Grace was upstairs and Luke was in bed. I found Dad in his office, going through some paperwork. Can we talk? I asked, standing awkwardly in the doorway. He looked up, clearly tired. What is it, Nathan? I stepped inside and set the registration form on his desk. Grace lied about it. She told Luke he missed the deadline, but it's right here. She didn't even try. Dad frowned, picking up the paper. Why would she do that? Because she doesn't care about Luke, I said bluntly. Or me. She only cares about Oliver and Sophia. And I'm sick of being treated like we're not part of this family. Dad sighed, setting the paper down. Nathan, I know things have been hard, but… No, I interrupted. You don't know. You don't see it because she hides it from you. But I see it every day. She's pushing us out, Dad, and if you don't stop it, she's going to tear this family apart. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he said, I'll talk to her. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was a start. I held on to a small flicker of hope after Dad promised to talk to Grace. Maybe, just maybe, he would finally see what I'd been trying to show him for months. But as the days passed, nothing seemed to change. Grace was as smug and dismissive as ever, and Dad acted like everything was fine. If he had confronted her, It clearly hadn't made any difference. Meanwhile, Luke was withdrawing more and more. He stopped asking for things, stopped trying to join in on family activities, and started spending most of his time alone in his room. It broke my heart to see him like that. But what could I do? Grace had made it clear we were outsiders in our own home, and Dad was either too blind or too spineless to stop her. One evening, I was sitting in my room, trying to focus on homework, when I heard voices downstairs. Grace's voice was low and tense, a sharp contrast to the cheery tone she usually used around Dad. Intrigued, I crept to the top of the stairs, careful not to make a sound. "I don't care what he thinks," Grace was saying, her voice edged with frustration. "You promised me this would work." The response was muffled, but I recognized the other voice immediately. It was Mason, a family friend who'd been hanging around a lot lately. He was in his early 20s and supposedly helping Grace with some home improvement projects, but I'd always thought there was something off about the way they interacted. "I'm doing my best," Mason said, his voice equally tense. "But you're the one who wanted this, Grace. Don't pin it all on me." I couldn't make sense of what they were arguing about, but the tone was unmistakably conspiratorial. My heart pounded as I leaned closer, straining to hear more. "You need to keep him on your side," Mason continued. "If he finds out—" "Shoo," Grace hissed. "Do you want Nathan or Luke to hear you?" I froze, my blood running cold. Why were they talking about me and Luke? What didn't they want Dad to find out? Before I could hear more, the sound of footsteps made me dart back to my room. I sat on my bed, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? I had always known Grace was manipulative, but this felt bigger than favoritism or neglect. This felt like a full-blown scheme. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I waited until everyone left the house. Dad was at work, Grace had taken Oliver and Sophia to some weekend activity, and Luke was at a friend's house. I started in Grace's office, a small room she'd claimed as her own when she moved in. Most of the drawers were locked, but I found a few papers in an open folder on her desk. They were mostly bills and schedules, but one document caught my eye. An email exchange between Grace and a divorce attorney. I read through it quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. The emails were dated months before she and Dad got married. In them, she discussed her financial situation and mentioned a promising relationship that could solve her problems. The implication was clear. Grace had been targeting Dad as a way out of her financial troubles, but it didn't stop there. As I flipped through more papers, I found old photographs of Grace and Mason, pictures that were definitely not platonic. They were holding hands in one, kissing in another. Some of the photos were recent, taken after she and Dad had gotten married. I felt sick. Grace wasn't just manipulative. She was a full-blown fraud. She was using Dad, and Mason was clearly in on it. I snapped photos of everything with my phone, my hands shaking. I needed proof if I was going to confront Dad. But I also needed to figure out how to handle this carefully. Grace was a master manipulator, and if I wasn't careful, she'd twist this around on me like she always did. That night, I showed the photos to Dylan. He stared at them in disbelief, shaking his head. "Dude, this is insane. You have to tell your dad." "I know," I said, running a hand through my hair. "But she's just going to deny everything. And even with the photos, I don't know if Dad will believe me." "He's so wrapped around her finger." "Then you need backup," Dylan said. "Someone who can back you up, or at least make sure Grace doesn't twist things." I thought about it and realized he was right. If I tried to confront her alone, she'd manipulate the situation like she always did. But who could I trust? The only person I could think of was Mason. He clearly wasn't happy with Grace, and if I could get him to spill the truth, it might be enough to break through Dad's denial. The next day, I waited until Mason came over to help Grace with another project. I caught him in the driveway before he went inside. "Mason," I said, stepping in front of him, "we need to talk." He looked startled, but tried to play it cool. "What about?" "I know what's going on," I said, keeping my voice low. "I heard you and Grace talking the other night, and I've seen the photos. I know she's using my dad, and I know you're in on it." Mason's face turned pale, and he glanced toward the house. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Cut the crap," I said. "I have proof. If you don't tell me the truth, I'll show it all to my dad." Do you really think Grace is going to protect you when this blows up? She'll throw you under the bus without a second thought. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. What do you want? The truth, I said. Everything. For a moment, Mason looked like he was about to walk away. But then he sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. Fine. Grace and I have been involved for a while. She married your dad because she needed stability, but she never planned to stick around forever. The idea was to make things work for a few years, get access to his assets, and then move on. I felt like I was going to throw up. And you're okay with this? Of course not, Mason snapped. But Grace has a way of pulling people into her messes. She's good at making you feel like you don't have a choice. I didn't feel sorry for him. He was just as complicit as she was. But at least now I had confirmation of what I'd suspected all along. That night, I decided it was time to confront Dad. I waited until Grace was out of the house and showed him everything. The photos, the emails, the conversation with Mason. At first, he was defensive, accusing me of trying to sabotage his marriage. But as I laid out the evidence, his expression shifted from anger to disbelief, and finally, to devastation. I didn't want to believe it, he said, his voice shaking. But I can't ignore this. What are you going to do? I asked, my heart pounding. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the photos in silence, his hands trembling. Finally, he said, I'll handle it. When Dad said he would handle it, I wasn't sure what to expect. Would he confront Grace head-on? Try to sweep everything under the rug like he always did? For the next few days, I waited on edge, watching for any sign that he'd taken action. But Grace carried on as if nothing had changed, smiling brightly, organizing dinners, and playing the doting wife. Dad, on the other hand, seemed distant, quieter than usual, his eyes shadowed by something I couldn't quite place. Then, one evening, everything exploded. I was upstairs in my room when I heard shouting. At first, I thought it was another one of Grace's passive-aggressive tirades, but Dad's voice cut through the air, sharp and furious in a way I'd never heard before. Don't lie to me, Grace, he bellowed. I've seen the emails. I've seen the pictures. How long have you been playing me? I crept down the stairs, careful to stay out of sight, my heart pounding. Grace's voice followed, defensive and trembling. James, I don't know where you're getting this from. Nathan. He's been trying to turn you against me. He's lying. Don't you dare put this on Nathan, Dad interrupted. I didn't want to believe him, but the proof is right there. You've been cheating on me, with Mason, no less. And all this time, I thought you cared about this family. This family? Grace snapped, her voice laced with venom. You think this family is so perfect? I've been trying to hold it together while your sons disrespect me at every turn. Do you have any idea how hard it's been to make them accept me? Accept you? Dad laughed bitterly. You didn't want acceptance. You wanted control. And you've been treating Nathan and Luke like they're disposable, just so your precious Oliver and Sophia could have everything handed to them. Don't act like a victim, Grace. You don't get to play that card anymore. For a moment, the house was silent. I held my breath, waiting to see what Grace would do. When she finally spoke, her voice was icy and calm, sending a chill down my spine. If you think you can just throw me out, you're wrong, she said. We're married, James. You don't get to just walk away from this. I don't care, Dad said. I'll fight you in court if I have to. But I'm not letting you destroy my family any more than you already have. The next morning, Grace was gone. She must have left during the night because by the time I came downstairs, her car was missing and the house was eerily quiet. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into his coffee like it held all the answers to his problems. She's gone? I asked cautiously. He looked up at me, his face lined with exhaustion. For now. She's staying with a friend until we figure out the next steps. I don't know what's going to happen, Nathan, but I promise you this. I'm done letting her come between us. It was a relief to hear him say it, but the damage had already been done. Luke was still withdrawn, and the house felt heavier without Grace's artificial cheeriness to mask the tension. Over the next few days, Dad made an effort to spend more time with us, but it was clear he was struggling to process everything. One evening, as we were sitting in the living room, Luke finally spoke up. Is Grace coming back? No, Dad said firmly. She won't be living with us anymore. Luke's face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought he was going to cry. I didn't like her, he admitted in a small voice, but I wanted us to be a family. We are a family, Dad said, pulling him into a hug. It might not look the way we thought it would, but we're going to be okay. I promise. As the weeks passed, things slowly began to improve. Without Grace in the picture, the house felt lighter, freer. Dad started taking a more active role in our lives, driving Luke to baseball practice. Yes, we got him signed up in time, and even helping me with my college applications. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the garage, I found a box of old family photos. There were pictures of Mom, smiling and carefree, holding Luke as a baby and laughing at something off camera. Seeing her face again brought a lump to my throat, but it also reminded me of the kind of family we used to be, the kind of family we could be again. The fallout with Grace wasn't over, of course. She and Dad had a messy divorce, and there were plenty of arguments about custody and finances. But through it all, Dad stayed true to his promise. He put us first, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were on solid ground. As for Grace, I don't know what happened to her. Last I heard, she'd moved out of state with Oliver and Sophia. I felt bad for them, in a way. They were just as much victims of her manipulation as we were. But I also knew it wasn't my responsibility to fix them. Looking back, I realized something important. Family isn't about blood or marriage or even promises. It's about showing up every day and choosing to put each other first. Grace claimed she wanted to be a mother to me, but in the end, her actions spoke louder than her words. She showed me exactly who she was and who I didn't want to be. Now, when I sit down to dinner with Dad and Luke, I feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It's not perfect, but it's ours. And for the first time, that's enough.